Thank you, Kristen, so much, and to all of you for coming. It's really just a great pleasure to share with you some of the research we've been able to do on the Frida Kahlo dos Mujeres, although remembering it's hard for me even to believe that a year ago we didn't even know about this picture at all. So last week, for those of you who were with us, we had a wonderful lecture by Dennis Carr, my colleague in Art of the Americas, who talked about indigenismo and the relationship of Kahlo's work to ancient American art. And I thought it would help us today if I built upon that and we talked a little bit about folk art, Mexican folk art, and how that influenced Kahlo early on. And of course, with 8 weeks afterwards to go, I think you're going to have a very rich offering here. So I really am going to be looking at just this early work in which Kahlo was able to emerge onto the scene with this picture, not just any picture by Kahlo, but actually the first painting she ever sold and the first painting by Kahlo to enter any public collection in New England. Dennis started with these 3 images, and I had the great opportunity to be sitting up front, so I was thinking about the 3 of these, and I actually was thinking for myself about Dos Mujeres in a slightly different context, which was that of our museum. And we're going to be looking today at the circle of Kahlo, and I thought really for us what would be most beneficial for all of you that I could offer was really placing our discussion in the context of the Making Modern installation on the top floor of the Art of the Americas wing, which is relatively new. It celebrates this circle that we're going to hear more about that's inscribed on the back of the painting. And it was really in this way when I first saw the Kahlo that I think my heart stopped. It was last November in New York City. I was on a number of different appointments and calls during sale week, and I went to visit Marianne Martin, who's a well-known, very well-respected dealer of Latin American art, in her gallery on 73rd Street. And Dos Mujeres was hanging there on the wall, and I immediately thought about as she described the picture, the 2 women in the picture were women who had worked in Kahlo's own home in her circle, her family circle, and when she turned around the back so that we could see that it had its original inscription, including Kahlo's own signature right at the top there and the date 1929, but moreover that it had been hidden really from public view for virtually its entire life other than 2 exhibitions briefly, one in Rome and one in Florida. So again, thinking about it, for us, the great icon of our collection, the working man at the far left there, Paul Revere, the Boyd daughters, so Paul Revere of 1768, the middle there, the Boyd Daughters by John Singer Sargent of 1882, and Dos Mujeres, not knowing it was going to become ours, of 1929. And why do I say that? Well, it was really to have something, to see something that had been in a private collection that could come to this, even to think about it. I said to my colleague Erica Hirschler, please come down and see this before you leave New York. The next day, we were back in Boston. I had a meeting with Matthew Teitelbaum, and I said, this is the sort of work we really should be thinking about if we're going to fulfill the mandate or the ambition of the Art of the Americas wing that we set out to create in 2001. And interestingly, he's a man of many wonderful questions. He said to me, well, Elliot, why has this picture not been sold? Was it advertised in 2012 on the front of the art newspaper? What do you think about that? And I said, well, it's interesting. I never think about an acquisition in terms of whether it's been on the market for a year or 50 years or 100 years if it's right for the museum. But then I thought about it some more, and I said, I really do think the reason this particular picture has not sold is owing to the fact that it depicts 2 maids. And if you're going to acquire a Frida Kahlo, most likely you're going to go after a painting of her self-portraits, of which we'll see many in a moment, or you're going to go after something more in the surrealist vein. I think people had overlooked this, in fact, even though it had been published on the front of the art newspaper. And I said to Matthew, my own question was, well, other than Las Meninas, what other great paintings of maids can you think of? And I'm showing here on the screen the Velázquez Las Meninas that is one of the great signatures of the Prado. Because I think you all know here in Boston, thanks to Erica's great work on the Boyds, that was really the underpinning for our own painting of the 4 Boyd girls. So in a way, the Dos Mujeres, I feel, Perhaps it was destined to come to our museum, although it wasn't necessarily an easy road, but we did have a wonderful collaboration with this son of the man who owned this work, who managed to give us many archival materials that we're going to look at today as part of our talk. So here's Erica when it first went out, modeling her Kahlo socks, and we have now a great deal of, this was in January when it first went out. It had only been in the building for about a month. So we were able to acquire it officially on December 16th of last year. It went out just about a month later in the Rotunda, where it is here in the Caravans Wall Rotunda. And it eventually became, as you see here, one of the galleries in the Making Modern, which again was on a very fast track thanks to this team of people. And I hope you'll come and hear my colleagues, Katie Hansen and Patrick Murphy. Many others, of course, worked on it, including Karen Haas, who worked on many of the photographs. We'll also be doing some Making Modern courses and looking together, so hope you'll come for those. So today, in thinking about the time we have together in the next hour, what I thought we would do is really take a look at the circle of Kahlo, as mentioned, and really think about her life leading up to Dos Mujeres. And I thought, well, what better way to begin than with her own painting of her biography, as you see here, her grandparents, her parents, and I. And it's this painting where she's standing actually as a little girl inside of her home where she would be born, where she was born, and where she died. For Kahlo, this sense of hybridity of the combination of her mother's family, which was of Mexican and Spanish heritage, and her father's family of German heritage. And interestingly, she, in a way, I think, and we'll maybe hear more in the course later when we hear about Rivera and Kahlo and gender politics, but Kahlo liked to say that her father was of German Jewish origin, but actually research bears out that they were Lutherans, but nonetheless to her, they were German Jewish because her husband, Diego, was Portuguese Jewish extraction as well as Mexican, so they shared that sense of hybridity. So she's painting this when she's almost 30. It's going to be beyond the scope of our thinking mostly today, but since it's her work, I think it really gives us an insight into how she thinks about her own biography and her own life. So the grandparents from her mother's side, of course, are associated with the Mexican landscape. You see the cacti there, whereas her father's family are out across the ocean, immigrating to Mexico City. Her father came there as a young man and practiced photography, which will be an important part of our story as you see as we go on. Now, interestingly, when Kahlo painted this in 1936, she had, as a very young person, the ambition to become a medical doctor, and I think you can see that she's not only drawn the umbilical cords that she's holding on to here, her mother with the tiny fetus of Frida Kahlo, even the little sperm and egg here that's, her interest in naturalism and really medical style drawing and drawings for naturalists was something she adopted early on, and we're going to see a few of those as we go forward. So just keep that in mind. This is actually the Blue House that you can visit in Mexico City. It's open to the public. I had the good fortune to visit Mexico City last April. We were out for the Wyeth opening in San Antonio, and between opening and program there, we went down for the weekend, and I had never been there before. And I think what really struck me more than anything was a city where you would land there on the ground and walk around, and if you got into a taxi or you just walked the street and looked at a billboard, everywhere you looked was Frida Kahlo. And if you think about here in Boston, I couldn't think of another city in the United States, other than Boston, where we have Copley Square, named for John Singleton Copley, where an artist had such prominence that everywhere you went, you really saw Frida Kahlo. And again, this was well before, this was April of 2015, so this was well before walking into Mary Ann Martin's gallery. But just to give you a feel for how the house looked and how accurate she really is here in terms of showing that brilliant blue with the red trim of the house, which she's echoed in the umbilical cords there. So early on, this is one of her father's photographs. Kahlo was clearly very comfortable in front of the camera. Again, it's been pointed out by a number of scholars. I do think it's an important point to bear in mind. I should have mentioned that her father had had a previous marriage, 2 older daughters. His first wife had died in childbirth for the second daughter, and when he married Kahlo's mother, she was actually the third of 4 daughters. So there were really 6 daughters of Guillermo Kahlo around. Some of them are shown in this photograph that he took of the family. And here, I just want to point out Cristina, who's going to become important. She actually signed the back of Dos Mujeres. She was the 4th of the 4 daughters with Frida's mother. But there you see Frida at the left, in boys' clothing, and early on she did adopt boys' clothing. At the age of 6, she suffered a bout of polio that left her right leg, quite withered. This was well before the accident that we're going to hear about in a moment. And as a result, she writes in her letters that she took in her early school years to becoming very active, lots of sports. She actually boxed, she rode a bike. But I think interestingly, and we'd have to do a little more work on this, some of the psychologists have done, like Frank Soloway, work on sort of birth order, but I think Kahlo very much identified with her father, and he certainly saw her intellectual potential and encouraged her. Primarily encouraged her to pursue her education, as was at the time fairly unusual for her to attend one of the elite preparatory schools in Mexico City, which had 2,000 students, of which 35 were girls, and she was one of that group. So here's the portrait of her father, done, again, quite a bit later than the period we're going to be speaking about, but you see here how much Kahlo really positions him relative to his camera, his profession of art making. And I'm sorry, I just want to go back a bit to the blue house, because as you see here, she's positioned really directly beneath her father there. I think, again, quite significant. She was very close to her mother, and she looked interestingly a bit like both of her parents, but I think the significance of placing herself there central to her home, the courtyard of her home and right beneath her father, says a lot about her own perspective as an artist and as someone who was really being pushed by her father. So she took on both the boys and the girls' clothes. Here she is at about the same age, not quite, but when she's 19, elegantly dressed in a photograph by her father. And I think you see there that direct stare that she's going to use in many of her self-portraits. Again, I think much of this is quite comfortable with sitting in front of a camera and really self-fashioning herself. And Dennis, I think, addressed that quite well last week in terms of her self-fashioning herself as someone of the Mexican indigenismo mode. So at the preparatory school, the National Preparatory School, she takes up with a group of 9 students, and they're called Los Cachucas for their sort of sloped hats that they were able to wear. And there again, she's the only girl in this group of 9, and she gets very involved with the leader of the pack, a young boy named Arias, who becomes her boyfriend. They hang out in cafes. They're interested in things artistic, in performances, in poetry, in intellectual life, and particularly in leftist-leaning causes. Eventually she'll become part of the Communist Party. But it turns out that these young friends, this group of 9, become amongst the intellectual elite of Mexico City overall. So just always think back of where are all your best friends from grade school and what are they up to now? There were lots of intrigues that she writes about, and I recommend 2 readings if you want to, further your interest on this on your handout. There's one excellent article by Jay Oles about Cafe Society of that period, and Jay has done really the best work, I think, on that period, which is still very little known. But certainly formed Kahlo. And also in the Hayden Herrera book, you'll find a lot of her letters that fortunately survive about those early years. So the intrigues of the girl meets boy and who's involved with whom, and she paints this self-portrait in a velvet dress for her boyfriend, Victor Arias, hoping to recapture his heart, because they were very, very close. So again, this is one of her earliest self-fashionings in oil. But very sophisticated, and in a way, in Mexico City, as Edward Weston would later say, Mexico City was his Paris. And I think in a way they are very much, as an international capital, highly sophisticated, intellectual, and really living out the world of the Bohemians in the best sense of the word as young people. So all that would change, and I see she's not Frida Kahlo, but she's Frida Kahlo, in the accident, and this is the only drawing she ever did and only image of that accident. At the age of 18, she and her boyfriend, Victor Arias, were riding on a wooden bus, and that wooden bus was struck quite violently by a metal trolley car. It left her really she was almost killed by this accident. It left her collarbone fractured, her spine open, her pelvis damaged, as well as her leg broken. So she was really just lucky to be alive. Her boyfriend remembered seeing her on the ground. Here she's bandaged up, but he remembered vividly that her clothes had somehow been thrown off in the course of the violent accident, and she was bleeding all over. She had to recover in bed for at least 1 month in the hospital, 2 months at home, and had pain really for the rest of her life. But amazingly enough, and sustained multiple surgeries as a result, but amazingly enough, maintained just an incredibly optimistic attitude despite it all. So again, she never really returned. This is an early image of the accident, but she never ever seemed to turn to it in paint or other images. But you'll see we're not going to look at many of the graphic images because I'm assuming they're going to come out as the course unrolls. But we will look at one at the Ford Hospital later on. So this is not her convalescing in bed, but she did take to painting as a way of, as really a form of therapy. This is when she's actually painting in Detroit, but you get the idea. When she was lying in bed, she had a series of constraints, sort of corsets and casts that kept basically her spine and her spinal cord together. And her parents, her father helped her, she had done a little bit of drawing with a local teacher of printmaking there, so she'd had some training with him and loved to draw. But it was really during the convalescence as an 18-year-old that she realized her hope of becoming a doctor was never going to be realized, and she might think about how to rehabilitate and redirect herself. So she turns to painting as a way to keep herself occupied during these months of convalescence. So her father helps her install a mirror above her bed so that she can see herself and use that as a model for her images. Here she's on a small-scale canvas, which she generally did work in a fairly small scale, although Dos Mujeres is not small, and I think that's interesting of her ambition at that period. And the painting I should have mentioned here, you can see it just barely. Dennis showed it last week, but she's actually painting this self-portrait of herself standing on the border between Mexico and the United States. And it's going to be really at about the end of our talk when she gets to Detroit. And the reason I wanted to go up at least that far is that we do have a video running in Making Modern in the Kahlo and her Circle gallery of her working with Diego. At least she's climbing up and down the scaffold watching him paint in Detroit. So this was something she did there. But early on, she also painted this other member of that group of the Los Cachucas. This is her friend Miguel Lira. She liked to call him by his nickname Chong Li. He was a well-known among the group, respected scholar of Chinese poetry. And what I just want you to note here is how she's incorporating lots of objects, some toys, a harp, a doll, lettering, again looking to some of the, at this period in 27, she's well aware of the French Cubists and the Spanish Cubists as well, but that flatness of the image is something we're going to keep seeing in her work, especially early on. She says, and it's, again, you'll have to look into the Herrera book where she says that, well, I painted Chong Li, but I'm not sure he really liked it very much, but this is how it came out for her, and she felt fairly pleased with it. So at the preparatory school, this is a later lithograph, at the age of 12, as the story goes, she apparently saw a well-known, the most famous Mexican muralist of all time, Diego Rivera, painting a mural on the wall of their school. And apparently, according to Diego, and again, on your bibliography, you have his autobiography that I recommend to you. He says that at that age of 12, she decided she was going to have Diego Rivera's baby then. Maybe. But in any event, later on, they would connect again when she was older, after the 12-year-old experience of seeing this was one of the images on as part of the mural at the preparatory school. But she was fascinated to see how he would paint. And I think I've got, oh, sorry, no, don't have that one. But later on, when the Ministry of Education was producing a mural where he was working, and he was the superstar of the Mexican mural movement. And in that regard, he says in his autobiography what happened on the second occasion. So this is when Kahlo is painting images like the one you just saw of Lyra. And I'm going to quote from Diego's autobiography. I was at work on one of the uppermost frescoes of the Ministry of Education building one day when I heard a girl shouting up at me, "Diego, please come down from there. I have something important to discuss with you." On the ground beneath me stood a girl of about 18. She had a fine, nervous body topped with a delicate face. Her hair was long, dark, and thick eyebrows met above her nose. They seemed like the wings of a blackbird, their black arches framing two extraordinary brown eyes. When I climbed down, she said, "I didn't come here for fun. I have to work to earn my livelihood. I have done paintings, which I want you to look over professionally. I want an absolutely straightforward opinion because I cannot afford to go on just to appease my vanity. I want you to tell me whether you think I can become a good enough artist to make it worth my while to go on." So Rivera, as he says, he recalls responding, "I looked at them one by one. I was immediately impressed. The canvases revealed an unusual energy of expression, precise delineation of character, and true severity. They showed none of the tricks in the names of originality that usually mark the work of ambitious beginners. They had a fundamental plastic honesty, an artistic personality of their own. They communicated a vital sensuality complemented by a merciless yet sensitive power of observation. It was obvious to me that this girl was an authentic artist," unquote. And yet Kahlo, ever skeptical, said, "The trouble is that some of your good friends have advised me not to put too much stock in what you say. They say that if a girl who asks your opinion and she's not an absolute horror, you are ready to gush all over her. Well, what I want you to tell me only one thing. Do you actually believe that I should continue to paint, or should I turn to some other work?" And he then finishes by saying, "I didn't know it then, but Frida would in fact had already become one of the most important facts of my life." So again, that early, very early encounter that stood out for both of them. And in her case, it was a second encounter that Rivera later sort of remembered the 12-year-old. I wanted to show you, in terms of thinking about her work and folk art, this work is, and I only just saw it at the reinstallation of the wonderful galleries out at Wellesley College's Davis Art Museum, no relation to me, but we were out there with the Colleagues' Day on Sunday when the labels weren't up, and I was struck by this because I wanted to just, it startled me. I knew I could use it for this purpose of thinking about Kahlo's work. What I didn't realize was, before I saw it there, and I later, my colleagues at Wellesley, when I asked them for information that they sent this morning, provided me with what you see here. In fact, it was a painting that Kahlo knew extremely well because it had been acquired by André Breton and included in an exhibition that she showed in Paris. But I think even beyond that, which is fascinating what's going on here, is this is an ex voto. It's a type of Mexican work, a popular work that you would have had at home as really a way to give thanks, but also to seek protection. And what's going on here is in the bed is a woman who had suffered actually from a surgical operation for breast cancer, and she was saved. And so this is a way of giving thanks. So when we think of some of these images that are quite graphic later on in the course of Frida Kahlo's work, this is something she would have known well. And the brilliant colors, I really commend you to see it on your own. Also, take a look at the way these figures are very close together, similar scale, whether they're men and women. And because I wanted to show you this work, this is the reason I really brought it to you, the bus, which was an early genre scene. And again, perhaps thinking about that horrific trolley car accident, she's imagining her life perhaps on the bus before it was struck, and so all the different types of people that are part of her world in Mexico City. And I should have mentioned that while she grew up in what seems to be this very large house and had her parents were well enough off to have the two women, Dos Mujeres, Salvadora and Herminia, working with them, money was always hard to come by. And her father, as a photographer, didn't have a great deal of funds available, and he always worried about the amount of the high medical bills that Frida Kahlo would incur. So you'll see what that leads to in a moment. So early on, these are, again, a little bit after the Dos Mujeres was painted in 1928, but the kind of thing she's thinking about, these very frontal portraits, very much part of Mexican folk painting in that regard. And pay attention also to the colors, the brilliant yellows and greens and these very opaque colors, because again, she's very much using the kinds of the palette from Mexican folk painting. Here's another one you see a larger scale in terms of showing the whole figure, but again, quite frontal, as she's often going to show her own self-portrait. And this is the kind of folk painting that would have been available to her in Mexico City, in addition to the ex voto type of painting. This was a folk type of portrait, or a local artist painting a little girl with a cat and a bird. And if those of you who know the Metropolitan's collection well will know they're also thinking in Mexico towards a more European antecedent, something like this by Goya, this work from the Metropolitan's collection, but a very similar mode, of course, of painting a young child with a bird about to be devoured by several hungry cats. This one too, the Jalisco School, and last week Dennis showed us, I meant to bring but I didn't bring, but a number of those ball-playing figures that Dennis showed that she incorporated into her paintings, or the one that was had the very long arm that was reaching over to grasp the two in the painting of the table, the wounded table. These kinds of portraits are from the same area of Mexico as those ancient American sculptures. But again, very frontal. This is the woman you see here with this square neckline, some small details and attributes, not so different and quite comparable in a way to our American folk art. And I think a topic we ought to think more carefully about is that Abby Aldrich was one of the great supporters of both Rivera and Kahlo, and I think, again, they shared this great love of the indigenous arts, and particularly folk art. So in 1929, actually this is a slightly later, again we're going to use her painting of her own wedding, but Frida Kahlo marries Diego Rivera. They marry in a small ceremony at her home in Coyoacan, which is a suburb of Mexico City, and she very much envisions herself as the wife of the great, established, the best-known, really mural painter in Mexico of all time. And he was sent by the Mexican government to study mural painting in Italy and in Europe. He knew Picasso. He was just a widely known figure. And so he's holding his palette here while she's holding him, and you don't see any attributes of her being an artist. And she's got the dove over their head. They were so different in scale. She was about 5'2", and I think she weighed maybe just over 100 pounds. And he was, at certain parts of his life, up to about 300 pounds and about 6'4". So they were the elephant and the dove, as they were often called. And she often played up to that contrast between the two of them. Here you see that frontal seated Kahlo that you saw earlier, related to her early portraits, but how it relates to folk art. I didn't realize myself until I started working on the gallery upstairs that Diego Rivera actually had been a twin himself. And his twin died, his twin brother Carlos, when he was 1.5. His mother had suffered many miscarriages as well, and each time she did, his father had given his mother a doll. So here's Frida. This is later in her life when she too had suffered multiple miscarriages, and she's shown with her doll, and she did collect many different kinds of things, objects, as Dennis alluded to, but including among them were dolls. And here they are in New York City, which I'm sure you're going to be hearing about next week a great deal when you think about Kahlo and Kahlo's revolutionary world. They both, Rivera and Kahlo, shared their love of the role of the worker in modern life, and particularly their support of the Communist Party, which they both joined in 1928, but in Mexico, but Rivera had been quite involved before that. And I love this small photograph that she's framed with some of those naturalist types of watercolors of passionate embrace, probably somewhere in New York City during their early life together, 1929, 1933. And her portrait of her husband later on, again, a little bit outside of our discussion today. So back to the muralist, Diego Rivera. I think what is important to bear in mind is that mural painting was very much part of the ideals of the Mexican Revolution, which upon Kahlo had herself tried to alter her birth date from 1907, when she was actually born, to 1910, so that she could align it directly with the revolution. But as the revolutionary ideas were to take hold in Mexico, the population that would benefit from them was largely illiterate. So mural painting, as it had been in Renaissance Italy, became one of the vehicles for representing these new ideals for the broader population. So that was one aspect of what we talk about in Making Modern. The other was the way that you would do that through not just mural painting, but in this case using lithography, which could have been rendered on stone and run off in multiple impressions. Same was true here in the United States, where it became the socialist press more or less was associated with lithography because it could be run off quickly and easily. And the other aspect was whom you painted. So you saw in some of those even folk art paintings that they were aspiring to look more European, perhaps, even if painting in a different mode. But indigenismo meant painting the everyday Mexicans, the workers that were farmers, that were workers such as this woman selling her fruit here. And look at what Diego's doing throughout, where he's really simplifying these forms of this little girl's braids and her the back as she sits there below the woman selling fruit. So this simplification is also part of this sense of modernity, where he's really reducing the forms to their simplest elements. This was another print upstairs. You can see it in the gallery, and it reproduces part of the mural at the Ministry of Education, as you saw this one does as well. And of course here the scene is quite appropriate because I think we saw it last week, but all of the children here are learning to read while right near the fields where their families were working. I wanted to show this as well. This is one of Rivera's early murals at the time she was painting Dos Mujeres, where she's actually shown at the Ministry of Public Education in the center here, holding arms with that brilliant orange shirt, centrally located, very much the focus of the scene as everything else is going on here. But again, as we think about Dos Mujeres, think about these faces as they are very closely aligned to one another, because again, that's going to be a strategy that's quite effective in the work that she did of this same year. And this one, I'm sure you'll be seeing more as well. This is one of the individual frescoes that Rivera painted for the Museum of Modern Art. It had been the subject of an exhibition just a few years ago. This happens to be part of our archive that we're going to be thinking about, the Circle of Kahlo. This drawing was given to the man, the collector who purchased Dos Mujeres in 1929, Jackson Cole Phillips. He knew Kahlo, obviously, he knew Rivera well. We're going to see him in a moment, but this is the first Rivera drawing to come to our museum as a sort of freestanding drawing. We had one that was tipped into a book. And I think it expresses this aspect of mural painting that I was mentioning, of the reduction of forms, the broad outlines. You see how the hands almost look cartoon-like, and that's an appropriate term because they're quite broadly rendered. And this is going to seem like a shock to see Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel ceiling Libyan Sibyl, but again, fresco painting required working very rapidly while the plaster was wet, and Diego, having worked in Italy, would have known this, but important to bear in mind are the ability of the outline to carry the contour. And so this is the Metropolitan's drawing, one of the few surviving drawings by Michelangelo, and you see here how contour, and we know this is part of how we perceive objects, is the strength of the outer line helps us understand them, and particularly when you're trying to read the images from below the floor. For those of you who've been inside of the Sistine Chapel will know. So upstairs, we also have this, the original wedding photograph. We believe it actually has original hand touching in watercolor by Frida Kahlo that she gave to Jackson Cole Phillips. This is how they presented themselves on the day of their wedding to a local photographer, a friend of Guillermo Kahlo, named Victor Reyes. So go take a look at it. It's got this wonderful deckled edge, and you can see how, again, she is very much subservient to the great Diego. He literally looms up over her there. This is it's a similar image, but it was used in the announcement in the newspaper, which you can also read up there with an inscription from a woman named Frances Torr, also part of the circle. Also in the gallery, this self-portrait by Diego Rivera, who was quite adept at making lithographs. He made a number of them and experimented as well. Frida had this one in her studio, and you'll see it in the back of a few of the photographs of her at the Blue House, where the Casa Azul, where she worked. This was one of the most experimental that he produced soon after they were married, of Frida, and I want to show you what it looked like initially on stone. And he decided that he would reverse it and produce this much more surrealist image by printing it twice and overlaying it. Of course, by 1930, he was already well known. He had already been in Paris, had worked with Picasso in the early decades, just around this time, a little before Picasso painted the portrait of a woman from our collection at the MFA. And again, you can see this upstairs. It's in the cubist mode, but it's doing, in a way, what Rivera was working with on stone. It's showing multiple images of the same woman, but not, of course, that we don't know who the woman is, but maybe one of Picasso's love interests. And here's Frida using a similar sort of approach in a later drawing of her own, where she's posing for herself and displaying her arm in different ways, sort of in multiple ways in the same image. So I just wanted to bring those through to have you connect with those. So the figures of whom you paint were as important as how you painted in the period of the post-revolution in Mexico. And in Rivera's case, indigenous people were very much everyday, as I said, everyday Mexicans at home. I'm sorry for the glare on this. This is another one of the Riveras from the collection of Jackson Cole Phillips, showing a mother and a child, possibly also having suffered from polio. There you see the legs are quite withered, and he's leaning back on the mother's arm as probably another sibling looking on there. A very tight group, and Dennis spoke last week about the importance of these straw mats. They went all the way back to the Mixtec group of indigenous Mexicans as representing royal space that could be moved from place to place. Here, in this case, they're really representing the home of the Mexican family, and they appear frequently. But what I wanted to also mention about this is that Rivera, having studied fresco painting with the Italian painters and studied from the murals themselves, the Renaissance murals that he visited in Italy, he was very interested in old master techniques, which is interesting interestingly, a combination that a number of the modernists use as well. And by that I mean upstairs, you'll be able to see Arthur Dove, The Sun on the Lake, using encaustic, which is a type of wax embedded with pigment. And you'll also be able to see it in the work of Carl Zerbe, where he's painting his own self-portrait as Job using wax that's been blended with pigment. And Frida Kahlo does it herself. This is actually almost like a fragment of a fresco. She calls it the very ugly. I find it actually quite beautiful because I love to think about it in relation to our own early Roman Fayum portraits. And Larry Berman happened to, I was walking by looking for one I could show you in our gallery, and this was Larry's recommendation. It's actually a little boy, so a young person, you can go and take a look at that yourself. I think some of you may remember I was not here at the MFA when this portrait was here on loan to us, very early, shown in that upright way in the chair, much like the folk art we've been seeing just a moment ago. And I wanted to remind you, although this is a later one, that Rivera is painting very similar kinds of portraits, this one of a little girl, close to the picture plane, meaning close to you on the surface there, with the chair forming that architectural, almost like a throne for this little girl. I had an opportunity, I brought this along because this is a photo on the right by Frida Kahlo's close friend Lucienne Bloch, whom she knew in New York City, and then later on when she was out in Detroit and she suffered her major tragedy there with her miscarriage of her first pregnancy with Diego. And Lucienne took this photograph, but she also had assisted Rivera, and importantly had the foresight to smuggle a camera into Rockefeller Center and take the photographs of the mural before the Rockefellers had it taken down. So it's thanks to Lucienne Bloch, who was herself quite an accomplished mural painter and painter. But I think what was most interesting about the letters, which you can all read if you want, if you go down to Washington, D.C., they're at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, is that she expresses what a great friend Frida Kahlo was to her, how supportive she was. And for me, this was really the first chance to think about Kahlo outside of that, the persona that you hear so much about. But she apparently loved to laugh, she loved to have a good time. A fiesta was very much a part of their world in Mexico, but Lucienne, when they didn't really have much, two nickels to rub together, as Lucienne would say, they always managed to have a good time. So I just wanted to put that in as a sort of friend looking at a fellow artist and friend. And here's the self-portrait of that time. So Kahlo, you've heard about her being on all sides of the gender spectrum, and I think you're going to hear a lot more about that next week. She was very close to this photographer, Tina Modotti, and we're going to see photographs by Tina. She was intimately involved with Tina Modotti. This photograph was right about the time she was painting Dos Mujeres. And in Herrera's book, you'll find a possible incident, and I don't know I hope I'm be able to come to the course next week and learn more, but apparently early on in her life at school, one of the female teachers approached Kahlo, and she desperately needed a job, and so there's a suggestion that perhaps her involvement with women and began then as a very young person. But again, you can go consult that yourself. But we do know she was closely and intimately involved with Tina Modotti. It turned out Rivera, after they were married, didn't have any problem with her female lovers, but he had a great deal of issue with her male lovers. And apparently the first time he found out one of them brandishing a gun, and got quite dramatic, but did not care for that at all. Here she is, Tina Modotti, who in 1923 arrived she was Italian-born. Her uncle had actually been a photographer, but she had made her way with her family from Italy to San Francisco. There she met the American-born photographer Edward Weston, who had a family of his own. They became lovers, and together they traveled to Mexico City in 1923. And that's when she became part of this whole circle, and it's apparently at one of Tina Modotti's parties that Kahlo and Rivera actually connected after their various meetings on the scaffold. So here's Weston. She must have been very engaging. She'd been a performer. She was really sounding like a polymath to me in that she was a dramatic actress. She obviously learned photography, as we'll see in a moment, and really excelled at that. She was highly intelligent and very much involved with leftist politics. So here she is reciting poetry as Edward Weston saw her. And upstairs we have an extraordinary opportunity to show you in her exhibition in Mexico City of 1929 when she had a show that was really of her own. She learned photography initially through Edward Weston, but she really became so accomplished. I just want to read to you what was written in the catalog for that exhibition, because it was there that the collector Jackson Cole Phillips bought virtually every photograph in the show. Now, photography was considered to be on par with mural painting and lithography as a modern form of expression appropriate for the ideals of the revolution. So this is what she wrote. And I quote from Medotti from her catalog of this 1929 show, Mexico City. Photography, precisely because it is based on what exists objectively before the camera, takes its place as the most satisfactory medium for registering objective life in all its aspects. And from this comes its documental value. If to this is added sensibility and understanding, and above all, a clear orientation to the place it should have in the field of historical development, I believe that the result is something worthy of a place in social production to which we all should contribute. So for her, she saw really photography as part of furthering the social impact of the revolution. And interestingly, her fellow artist and muralist who worked with Rivera and the greats, Alfonso Siqueiros, who wrote the catalog, felt that, along with Rivera, that her own photographs had far surpassed those of Weston. This is one of my favorites, the child in a sombrero, and they're the son of one of the farmers in Agarista. This to just show you the kind of work that Weston was doing, and you see these toys and dolls that are going to appear in a number of his works. These are all kinds of folk objects that would have been available readily in the Mexican markets. But here's Medotti really taking on the harsh side of life in Mexico City and an urban center in this scene of misery. And I think she very much shares this sensibility with Kahlo, not backing off of those really, in some cases, in Kahlo's case, gory and gruesome scenes. And very tender ones as well. The mother and child here, nursing, scenes of maternity that also Rivera painted. Very eloquent scenes of hands performing labor, in this case, laundry that's being washed. And I love this one. I think this one will resonate for those of you who were here last week and saw a number of those ancient American objects. We have them on level LG of the wing. But here she's calling this mother holding a baby an Aztec baby for the way that that flesh is really, she's grasping it, and it appears as one of those, that kind of Jalisco type of figure. And just to remind you that Edward Weston was doing similar kinds of things, but in a different way, but this one resonating with the family group that Rivera portrayed on the Patate, or the straw mat. And you see how in both of these images, the straw mat is very much part of the image itself. In case you didn't see it here, you can see it much more closely in the actual work upstairs. Again, another one of my favorite Medottis of just a very simple still life, but yet how it conveys the revolution, the sickle, the bandolier, and the corn of the agrarian worker. They're intertwined. Very, very simple, but very powerful. Just a little bit of that fun side of Rivera and his family group. I wanted to point out here Kahlo's younger sister, Christina. It would form in a very large rupture this very year in 1933 when Christina Kahlo would have an affair with her husband, Diego. And so it was at that point that they divorced and then later remarried a year later. Weston, again, using the folk toys from the marketplace here with the straw now used as to create that shallow sense of space. Ones like this will be coming into the gallery soon. We'll be rotating the works upstairs in about around April of next year, so keep an eye on it. But just to show you that Kahlo herself loved collecting these small objects and toys, and here you see her own watercolor of the year that she's painting, Dos Mujeres, right, in a small scale watercolor of these woven straw toys. And again, I just love the fact that here she's holding a simple sculpture in the fields, and this is what she would have been, sort of how she looked at the age she was roughly when she was just soon after her marriage to Diego Rivera. This will be coming into the gallery, this frontal portrait of Irina Strela. It's showing her, again, with the Patate mat. Rivera and Kahlo both were great lovers of animals, so the cat gets a lot of prominence here with Irina Strela, but look what's strewn out there on the foreground, all of these children's toys. And there was a great deal of interest in the world of childhood drawings, childhood play, and folk art. It's all really intertwined for these early modernists as a way to get at a different form of working and sort of a more humble but perhaps purer form of expression. I just wanted, this one unfortunately is not up, but it is in our collection, but here's Joseph Stella about 1930 using these brilliant Mexican colors himself to show children's toys and marionettes in his still life. Weston, one of the aspects of folk art that we tend to not think about, but it's around us all the time, even in our own world. If you look carefully, it's all about sign painting, and I think in American, in U.S. folk art collections, trade signs, tavern signs, house painted signs, or purveyors of different forms were often collected as amongst the most expressive forms of folk art. Well, the same was true in Mexico. Edward Weston, Rivera, and others loved looking at the painters of the popular, basically bars or taverns called pulqueria, where you drank pulque, which was made out of a drink sort of made out of out of the center of cactus. And here are two boys beneath this window painted out as though it's looking out onto the Mexican landscape. So a photograph of a painted scene, and the lettering is also quite distinctive. So on this, this gives you a little bit of the color, not too much, but you can see some of the wall paintings here of this from this postcard, and where you've got other, popular paper fans and flags hanging as well. Weston knew Rivera well enough to photograph him, and we've got 3 upstairs. Here he is, not making any bones about his stomach there, or his rear end. And Rivera was able to laugh at himself. He said that occasionally when he was painting on a number of the scaffolds, wherever he was, that he felt very exposed, that people were often looking at his rear view, so maybe Weston was making the most of that. And he loved being distinctive in Europe, wearing his Mexican sombrero. He had apparently quite a large head, which would make sense, he's quite large. And here he is with Weston, and I love the way Weston has framed him, probably either with his own mural. We'd have to do a little more work to figure out exactly what that is, but if not, maybe it's just a part of a pulqueria that he's photographed with there, but really creating almost like a halo of a mural painting of a popular kind, or perhaps even his own. Now, I forgot to point out, and I put this slide in to remind us that it's quite fascinating, I think, that these very important early modernist women painters both married men more than 20 years older. O'Keeffe married Alfred Stieglitz, 23 years her senior, and for Kahlo, Diego Rivera was 22 years her senior. So take a look and think about that as you go upstairs and take in the first gallery of Making Modern. Of course, Stieglitz was one of the most important, if not the one of many important early modernist promoters of the American artist, and certainly O'Keeffe would have known that. And when when her friend showed her works to Alfred Stieglitz, in 1915, it really made her career. And so you can think about that a bit. When Frida Kahlo was married to Diego Rivera, she knew well that he was someone who'd had many, many affairs, and she knew he was a womanizer, so she knew full well what she was getting into, but clearly, even as a 12-year-old, seemed to have her sights set on becoming an artist. She did also use her feminine wiles, however, with another gallerist in New York, this one, Julian Levy, and these photographs are more explicit than shown here. But in 1938, and I'm sure you'll be hearing about this in the course, she does end up having her only solo exhibition in New York City at the Julian Levy Gallery. However, she was well known and well respected by many of her contemporaries, and one of the quotes I love, not just her own husband, but the fact that Picasso, writing to Diego Rivera, said, "Nobody paints a face like Frida Kahlo, not you, not I, and not our colleague André Derain." But now, before we have some time for questions, I wanted to make sure you knew who this man is. He's really the man behind Dos Mujeres. His name is Jackson Cole Phillips. Here he is in a photograph by Tina Modotti, whom he knew well. He was born in Providence, Rhode Island. He studied at Brown University, where he trained as an engineer. He went early on into the National Guard, which was at school for him, like the ROTC program, and he ended up serving on the Mexican-American border in Texas to put down the uprising of Pancho Villa. So early on he was familiar with Mexico, but he was later sent to Mexico City, which is how he became engaged there among the circle of Kahlo. He was sent there to build a power plant with American Light and Power, and he then later built power plants throughout, not just in Mexico, but in Latin America, in Cuba, and even in Asia. But he was very much an intellectual. He had probably been introduced to the circle of Kahlo and Rivera through his friend Frances Torr, an intellectual, and we're going to see her magazine that she edited, Mexican Folkways, in a moment. But he was clearly very comfortable around Modotti, and he did, unfortunately the negatives have not survived, but the later prints have, of Jackson Cole Phillips at ease, as you can almost hear her saying, "Oh, pose, Jackson, with your cigarette, move your book, do this, do that." So here he is, and this is an original. It's upstairs now. It won't be there after April, but it's suspected that Modotti actually hand-touched this impression, in fact, for the portrait sitting of Jackson Cole Phillips. Here's Mexican Folkways. This was a magazine about Mexican art and culture, including poetry. It was co-edited by Frances Torr and Diego Rivera, who rendered the double serpent with the Aztec sun rising beneath it for the frontispiece. And inside, you can see the contents. It's a little bit hard to read down, but in this issue of April to June of 1929 was the first publication of Frida Kahlo's Dos Mujeres. So it was published with a photograph by Tina Modotti in Mexican Folkways, and we have the issue on view upstairs in the gallery. So here he is again, Jackson Cole Phillips. These small, they're going to look huge on the screen. They're just small, tiny snapshots. Were part of Jackson Cole Phillips's scrapbook, and I love these because this was probably the age Kahlo was when he first knew her. Here she is standing in the doorway of her home, the Blue House, and here she is. Look at how young she looks there on the wall at the house, and you can see these originals upstairs in the gallery in the case. This work did not come to the MFA because the family retained it. It was very, very personal. It was the last photograph before Kahlo died at the age of 47. And she wrote here this is her handwriting, Frida's handwriting, "Para Jackson, for Jackson, with all my enormous love forever, Frida, in 1953, since 1929. Now in Mexico, child of my heart." So clearly something very personal to Jackson Cole Phillips in the sense that she remembered that early sale and clearly remembered Jackson. Jackson, it turns out, was a very forward-thinking American in Mexico City in that he acquired a number of important works, and you'll see them upstairs in addition to the family group by Rivera. There's another Rivera drawing up there of maternity that was inscribed to his wife. Also this work by Carlos Merida, he bought that same year as he bought all the Modotti photographs. And interestingly, Merida worked with Rivera as a mural assistant. Here he is painting painting two indigenous Mexicans with their colorful serapes. Later on his work, he would work on some of these prints that reproduced in silkscreen folk types of clothing, and yet he then eventually just abandoned that style altogether and moved towards more architectural types of scenes, this is one from our collection at the MFA. It's not on view, but it has previously been on view soon after the wing opened in the last 5 years, it was up on view. And now I wanted to just show you more about Dos Mujeres, some of the inside look. Here's the back. You've met a number of these people. You, of course, met Frida. Here's Frances Torr, who's remarking upon the memory of a most enjoyable evening. Here's Jackson Cole Phillips, Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, and some work for us to do. The dealer had suggested it was the Moats, Alice and her daughter, but this clearly is not an M, so we have to do a little more. We haven't figured that out. If anyone in the course can figure that out for us, we'd be very happy. I'm grateful to our conservator, Rona Macbeth, who did an incredible job. This is the X-ray of this work, and you can see how Kahlo was working with, here you see the two ruffles, and here you see how the faces interrelate of Salvadora and Herminia. As we come along here, you see the relationship of the two cheeks, which was something Kahlo clearly had gone back and altered, because they very much represent indigenous Mexicans based on their foreheads, their cheekbones, and the shapes of their mouths. And yet they're very distinctive, and yet they show very much together. They're placed close together. Here you can see through the X-ray how Kahlo has taken away what appears to have been a ruffle, perhaps an apron, we think, on Salvadora, the woman behind. And she also reduced and simplified the ruffles on Herminia's blue dress, so that she's reduced them from 3 to 2. And in some degree, you can see, I think, that there was probably another type of apron, almost like a apron with 2 very simple straps, perhaps, on Herminia. But she really does want these 2 women to appear as individuals, as you see them here. Brilliantly colored, flat, picture plane. I think you've now seen that regularly in her work. A very brilliant foliage background. The blue house, as I think Dennis showed pictures of the garden that surrounded it, of course. Kahlo herself loved these naturalist kinds of details. She's animated the background, some details that I love, the butterfly that's flying and more open. She's really offset the 2 faces with these 2, what Adriana Zavala has identified as Mexican limas, a type of fruit that was indigenous to Mexico. But I think now that you know about her relationships with Tina Modotti and her about to be married, she's painting this in 28, she would marry Rivera a month after the sale. In July of 1929 was the sale. The marriage was of August of 29. So I think in many ways she's thinking about her own place in the world, and yet these were 2 women that not only she's elevating, and they're working women that she's elevating to the realm of fine art, and yet with the sale, as documented on the back, to Jackson Cole Phillips, she's becoming a working artist herself, and you know how important that was to her in that first encounter she had with Diego Rivera. Will I be able to make my living as an artist? This was the document that I saw in the dealer's gallery that allowed us to really even think about this for the MFA. This is the photograph that Tina Modotti took to export this work to the United States in 1929. Jackson Cole Phillips probably brought this back, possibly rolled up in his suitcase unframed. We think about that because of some of the horizontal lines that are on the canvas, on the front of the canvas. And take a look down here when you see it up in the gallery at her signature, because she's using her German spelling of her name at that early stage, Frida, with an E, not just an Frida. She later made it seemingly more Spanish. But nowadays, Frida Kahlo's work, wherever it might be found, is considered cultural patrimony for Mexico. So after 1985, the Mexican government put that in place. So it would be very difficult for us to acquire any work by Frida Kahlo unless, like this one, it had been out for a very long time. Upstairs you'll find this work as well. This is the classic portrait of Frida Kahlo taken by her later lover, Nicholas Murray. It was owned by Jackson Cole Phillips as well, and I think it's how everybody thinks of her. Here he is, Murray, with her, and here's Christina Kahlo. They later reconciled after that great rupture over Diego. And here you see it in color. I think Dennis showed you one of these. And I brought the, I just wanted to point out that I think there's still a great deal of work to be done on Kahlo's own relationships here in the United States. This was one of her benefactors when she visited San Francisco, and up in Making Modern, we have a very short clip of her sketching when she landed in San Francisco. Rivera was painting murals there. She met Luther Burbank, and again, you see her naturalist interest coming out here in her Day of the Dead Mexican heritage, too, with that sort of corpse underneath the ground there. And she traveled to Detroit, where she painted this. You saw it earlier, and I'm sure you'll be hearing more about it. Here she is visiting the River Rouge, the Detroit, the Ford motor plant. And later, her husband, Diego, painted this portrait of one of the Ford family, who then made it possible for Diego to paint the murals at the Detroit Institute of Art, which I had a chance to revisit only about 10 days ago when I was out in Michigan, and loved seeing them. But this is where she was. Look what she found in a window in Detroit. So American, quite surprising to me, an oil on metal of these little objects that you've been seeing in a Mexican context, but what captured her imagination as she was wandering around Detroit while Diego was painting there. This is a little bit hard to see, but during that same period in Detroit, she's creating these really fantastical drawings, her naturalist bent here, but these are very surrealist about her dreams, and you see Diego central to that dream, another self-portrait, which I think is beautiful. And take a look upstairs as you see her sketching. This was the work that that really, I think you have to think about in the context of Tina Modotti, where she's not going to back off the more difficult sides of life and think back to that ex voto that we saw initially, the one at Wellesley College's museum. And I just wanted to read from Rivera's own autobiography what he had to say about this, because he said of Frida, and this is her, she knew she was pregnant, but she unfortunately lost the child, and she was at Henry Ford Hospital, so hence the title of this work. But I quote from Rivera, "Frida's tragedy, for such she felt her experience to be, inspired her to paint a canvas depicting a miscarriage and expressing the sensations and emotions it gives rise to. She also painted a picture representing her own birth. Immediately thereafter, she began to work on a series of masterpieces which had no precedent in the history of art, paintings which exalted the feminine qualities of endurance to truth, reality, cruelty, and suffering. Never before had a woman put such agonized poetry on canvas as Frida did at this time in Detroit." So again, as we go through the course, just keep that in mind, because I think she is someone who's constantly drawing on this reservoir of her own life and then winding it and wetting it back through so many different traditions. And I think that's really what is at the core of her staying power as an artist. So just I wanted to bring back for you to remember the ex voto. But I think in all, we should let her, Frida Kahlo, have the last word, and I can show you just how these were about twinning images as well. So the two Fridas, I think the two faces in Dos Mujeres with the two Fridas of a later period. Here she's showing a double portrait with Diego and I. And there, her husband, in one of the murals where he's using, ironically, the Nicholas Murray photograph, he's showing her in this twin sense of the yin and the yang, where she's holding that herself there in this particular mural. And just in our own galleries, as we think about her work and other sources for Frida Kahlo, you've got the foundation with the ancient American work, but don't forget she had many access at her school and at home through her father to artists in books, in the library in Mexico City, which was a very large library. So artists of the German Renaissance, such as this one, which is from our own galleries upstairs, and I checked on these yesterday, this one is on view. She loved the Italian Renaissance painters, and you know now about how much they were part of Diego's formation as a modern muralist. This one also upstairs, and I think there, it's a little bit hard to see in this slide, but take a look at this particular ascension and how close the faces are to one another there. And then I began, just as I had time, to think about commending you to other double portraits, the two sisters in the Montegiasi, to think about how Dos Mujeres fit within that, or even the great Gauguin, and particularly these twin seated women there, to me, had a certain resonance, and certainly Kahlo could well have known this image by Gauguin. I wanted to just treat you to the before and after, thanks to Rona Macbeth and all the work she did. This painting was in excellent, excellent shape, but we did remove a very thin layer of varnish, and you can see that detail as it stood, probably drawn, painted in by Kahlo. We just don't know, and really all Rona has done is just really touched it back so it doesn't bother you. But the last word I wanted to give, the last words to Kahlo, two of my favorite quotes of hers. The first is, "Nothing is worth more than laughter. It is the strength to laugh and to abandon oneself to be light." And the second one, which I think is probably why she has such great wide resonance, and when you land in a place like Mexico City, she speaks to so many. I quote from her, "I used to think I was the strangest person in the world, but then I thought there are so many people in the world, there must be someone just like me who feels bizarre and flawed in the same ways I do. I would imagine her and imagine that she must be out there thinking of me too. Well, I hope that if you are out there and read this and know that yes, it is true, I'm here and I'm just as strange as you." Thank you so much. And I think we have time for some questions for those who would like to ask any questions.
We have microphones on either side
Oh, yes,
of the room.
Kristen's got the mics. Thank you.
Any questions today?
Questions, anyone? I see one hand up at the back. Thanks, Lauren.
Given her many injuries, I'm surprised that we didn't see any milagras.
You can see, I'm sorry.
Milagras, the custom of making a sculpture of the body part that's afflicted as a way of invoking healing. No milagras in her life?
Not that I know of. There are, we were actually offered even here at the MFA one of her painted casts that she wore, like a body cast, which she actually painted the way many people, even kids, paint. I don't know of any objects of that sort, but I do know that she describes asking Lucienne Bloch when she's in Detroit to bring her very specific and explicit medical images of the pelvis, because her pelvis was really one of the reasons she couldn't bear children, that it had been damaged, as well as her spinal cord, and she had a lot of other issues as well. But she specifically asks that she wants medical quality drawings so that she can render the Henry Ford Hospital painting. And remember, this is a woman who wanted to study medicine, so I think maybe that's one way to think about that sort of healing process, perhaps, but I'll leave that to you, because I don't know that much about that tradition, I'm sorry to say. Yes?
Would Frida and Georgia O'Keeffe have known each other?
Yes, that's a great question. I meant to mention that they actually were when Kahlo had the exhibition in New York in 1937, already the huge experience of the Rockefeller murals had occurred, and Rivera was really a sensation throughout the United States for a variety of reasons. There were many artistic luminaries on the list, and one of them was O'Keeffe, and there's a little mention in the Herrera biography of her flirting with O'Keeffe. And again, beyond that, I don't know too much about how much she knew or was involved with O'Keeffe, but certainly they knew one another for sure. O'Keeffe would have been quite a bit older than Kahlo. Right there, yes.
So she predeceased Diego Rivera.
She did. She only lived to be 47, and I should have mentioned that we consider her body of work that survives to be about 140 paintings, of which about a third of those, about 50 or so, are self-portraits. Rivera always said that she was the most important person in her life. He did later remarry. So he had.
That was my question. Was how much longer?
I recommend for you the autobiography. I put it on the list there of the handout, and I think it's just an interesting read. He connects with lots of people, and it's quite interesting. I thought I saw one other person, but maybe I'm wrong. Anyone else?
Thank you so much, Elliot.
Thank
you
you
for coming today.